Today we continue, and I hope complete, the discussion of the default position of the contemporary progressives, liberal or flexibilized, but nevertheless institutionally conservative social democracy. Toward the end of the last class, we discussed one of the characteristic concerns of this updated social democracy: flexibility in the labor markets, and the relation of flexibility to radical economic insecurity. I will begin today's class by discussing at somewhat greater length another characteristic concern of contemporary social democracy, which is the moderation of the inequalities generated in the market through recourse to compensatory and retrospective redistribution by tax and transfer. That is to say, by progressive taxation and redistributive social entitlements. Now, this is a subject of the greatest practical and theoretical significance. After all, throughout the most characteristic interest of the contemporary progressives, not just in this second stage of social democracy, but in the original social democratic settlement, was to mitigate inequality through compensatory redistribution. So before going forward to our broader programmatic agenda, it is vital to gain clarity about the proper role of compensatory redistribution by tax and transfer, what it can and cannot achieve, and how it achieves what it achieves. And then in the remainder of the class, I turn to a brief exploration of the structural problems that this modernized form of social democracy cannot adequately solve or even address. After all, this is the central point in any criticism of contemporary social democracy. There has to be an argument about what it cannot do without undergoing a radical transformation of its program. And I have in mind then to discuss 5 issues: the provision of public services, the relation of finance to the real economy, the hierarchical segmentation of the production system, that is to say, the division between advanced and backward parts of production, and its consequences for economic growth and economic inequality. The practical basis of social cohesion, and the character and future of democracy. So I'm going to return later in the course in much greater detail to most of these themes. And therefore, my discussion of them now, in this part of our argument, will be summary, will be an anticipation of a fuller inquiry later. The main purpose in the general plan of the argument is then to build a bridge between the criticism of contemporary social democracy and the discussion of the progressive agenda that we miss and need. So first, compensatory redistribution by tax and transfer. You remember my suggestion last week that social democracy has retreated from its original agenda to the last line of defense. The last line of defense is the preservation of a high level of social entitlements. It turns out that these social entitlements are in the most egalitarian social democracies financed not by progressive taxation, but in very large part by the regressive and indirect taxation of consumption. I claimed that compensatory redistribution by tax and transfer never has more than a marginal effect on inequality, and that its most important use is to sustain a high level of investment in people and in their capabilities. And it is true that that high level of investment in people and their capabilities has consequences for inequality. It can moderate inequality. But the moderation of inequality is not the principal effect. The greatest historical achievement of social democracy has been to uphold this high level of investment in people and their capabilities at the cost of accepting a series of severe restraints on its transformative ambitions, at the cost of renouncing any attempt to transform in a more consequential way the economic and political structure of society. Now I want to develop this argument in the context of this discussion of the contemporary flexibilized form of social democracy. And I do so by putting forward three theses informed by comparative historical experience. The first thesis is that what matters most for the diminishment of inequality, the overriding concern of contemporary progressives, is not the after-the-fact correction of the inequalities generated in the market by progressive taxation and redistributive social entitlements. It is always the transformation of the institutional arrangements that shape the primary or fundamental distribution of economic and educational advantage. So we can distinguish for this purpose between the primary or fundamental distribution that results from the operation of the market economy and of the educational system as they are now organized, and the after-the-fact correction of this fundamental distribution. Therefore, the derivative or secondary distribution as a result of progressive taxation and redistributive social entitlements. And the thesis is very simple. The thesis is that overwhelmingly what matters to inequality is the shape of the fundamental distribution. The shape that is given to it by the institutional arrangements and practices of the market economy against the background of the organization of politics. And in mentioning the example of Scandinavian social democracy, I claimed that their most important characteristics have been determined not by the welfare state that is so admired throughout the world, but by many decades of struggle over access to economic advantage and political power, and the institutionalization of a certain compromise in these societies. So what then are some examples of what I mean by this structural intervention, this intervention in the arrangements that shape the fundamental distribution? So here are three large themes that we have already begun to discuss and will discuss at much greater length as we move forward. The first is everything that has to do with the relation between the more advanced and the more backward parts of the production system, what I'm calling the hierarchical segmentation of the production system. There is always a more advanced part of production and more backward parts. The more advanced being, in the long term, over time, the most productive, and the one that has the greatest fecundity of influence in determining the future course of the economy. And the question is always, who has access to this most advanced part of the economy? How open or closed are the gateways to it? Or alternatively, to what extent is this most advanced practice disseminated throughout the production system, or on the contrary, confined to certain sectors or to fringes in every sector, as the knowledge economy now is? A second example of a structural issue is the relation of labor to capital. On what terms can labor be bought and sold? What is the dominant form of free labor? How is labor organized? What are its powers vis-a-vis capital? And how do these relative powers vis-a-vis capital determine its share of national income? Then a third example has to do with the relation of finance to production, to the real economy. How close or loose is the relation of finance to the real economy? How broad is the access to capital, and to what extent or by what terms can capital be mobilized for productive activity? By whom and how? These are examples of fundamental structural issues. And they ultimately lead us to the question, what is the institutional and legal content of the market economy. So the theoretical premise of these controversies is that the market economy has no single natural and necessary form, and that different forms vary not only in their distributive consequences, but also in the way that they organize production and exchange. Now, this idea that the market economy is institutionally and legally indeterminate, that it has no pre-established and fixed content, that there is no natural system of private law, the law of contract and property, may not be intuitively clear. It may not be self-evident. And yet, it is the single greatest analytical accomplishment of contemporary legal theory to demonstrate that the market has no fixed legal and institutional content, that there's no natural or necessary regime of property and contract, no one way of organizing the decentralization of economic activity. Let me develop that idea just for a moment. At the most abstract level, just to show you that this point is not just about legal and institutional details. It's about the fundamentals. Even at the most abstract level, the idea of a market economy, of a decentralization of economic initiative, has at least two dimensions. One dimension is the absolute level of economic decentralization. The number of economic agents able to bargain on their own initiative and for their own account. Agents who were not controlled by another agent in their initiatives. Another dimension of this abstract idea of a market is the degree of control that each of those agents has over the resources at his command. Will this be an absolute and perpetual control, or will it be temporary and conditional? So the unified property right, creation of the 19th century, has this idea that all the powers that we associate with property are normally brought together and vested in a single right holder, the owner. And we still think of that as somehow the natural form of property. But in the history of law, in the West and throughout the world, that form of property is an anomaly. Characteristically, the constituent powers of property, which in the civil law tradition are called use, usufruct, and dominion, the power to alienate, are separated and vested in different tiers of right holders. European feudalism is an example of the disaggregation of property rights. That was the normal form of property throughout the history of law. So the assumption coming from the 19th century is that these two dimensions, absolute decentralization and absolute control, go together, but they don't go together. And it's easy to see how the creation of temporary or conditional property rights could serve the increase of economic decentralization. Just take as a thought experiment the following idea. This has nothing to do with the proximate agenda of reform. It's a thought experiment just to make manifest the indeterminacy or the contradictions of the idea of property and of the market. Imagine a system in which no one has permanent property. The state coordinates access to the resources of society, not through a discretionary allocation, but under a system in which any group of economic agents can bid to control these resources, a package of resources, so long as they can return to society the highest rate of return for those resources. So it's like a loan of the productive resources from society. And the underlying rate of interest then becomes the charge for the temporary use of those resources and the basis of state finance instead of taxation. Now, such a system, just a thought experiment, would compromise the absoluteness of the control, but has the potential radically to extend the level of absolute economic decentralization. And that's just to suggest to you how it is that what we think of as natural is not natural at all, but a legal institutional construction. But the broader point is that the structural intervention, the intervention in the structure that shapes the primary distribution, is what matters. Now, you can see why that would be so. If the market operates in a certain way and generates certain inequalities, and then after the fact, you attempt to correct for those inequalities by some redistributive mechanism, you create a tension between the established economic arrangements and incentives and the egalitarian redistributive impulse. So the egalitarian redistributive exercise will have an economic cost because it will work against the logic of the operation of the market. And that tension is captured in the conventional rhetoric of contemporary policy discourse, a tension between efficiency and equity. That idea that there's a tension between efficiency and equity is based on this assumption that the move toward greater equality is achieved retrospectively against the logic of the market. So if there are vast inequalities anchored in what I just called the hierarchical segmentation of the market, the retrospective redistribution, to be adequate, will have to be very large. But the larger it is, the more it will tend to undermine the logic of the market, to derange the established incentives to save, invest, and employ. And then people will say, well, if you go that far, if you continue going in this direction, you're going to make everyone poorer. So you will have equality in poverty, and no one wants that. So That's the basis of a large part of the contemporary discussions between right and left. It's just that. It comes down to that. And you see what is paradoxical about this, that the contemporary progressives on the whole harness their egalitarian impulse almost exclusively to this project of retrospective correction. But by its very nature, the project of retrospective correction is very limited in its potential reach, given this tension, given the problem of the economic cost of the retrospective correction. You could imagine a radical redistributive mechanism, as in the idea of ancient Sparta. The free men are all alike. They're not allowed to have distinct economic positions. Or a system in which everyone is a smallholder in an agricultural economy, and there are radical restraints on alienation. No one can buy anyone else's land. Now, there will then be an imposed equality through this redistributive mechanism, but at the cost of a complete suppression of economic and even cultural dynamism, and that will not be tolerated in any contemporary society. That's the fundamental problem. And that is the basic reason, the basis for this thesis of the primacy of structural change over redistributive correction. So, what is the fundamental answer of the contemporary progressives to this thesis? The fundamental answer seems to be there are no structural alternatives. Or if there are any, they're too dangerous. So the whole argument turns on the existence or non-existence of the structural alternatives. If they existed, on this argument, they would be much better. But then it seems that a great deal of the effort of the contemporary progressives should be devoted to examining whether or not they exist and what they might be. And it seems that that's not the case. Well, that's the first of these three theses, so let me stop and invite your engagement. There could hardly be a more fundamental point in the criticism of contemporary progressivism. Yes?
Just to better understand your point about redistribution after the fact being against the logic of the market.
Yes.
Is that an economic argument that once everything's all distributed out, it's inefficient because of that, or it's almost more like a behavioral economic, once people have it, just they feel a sense of ownership and that creates a political obstacle, but it's not a distribution.
I'm not sure I grasp the significance of the distinction. So the market there's a particular form of the market with a certain set of arrangements. And these arrangements are associated or combined with incentives. The incentives are based on the arrangements. So if you then have a redistributive mechanism that passes the threshold of moderation, it works against those incentives. It cancels them out, as it were. So that's the idea. It is an economic idea. It's not just some behavioral or psychological point. The whole system of arrangements is associated with a system of incentives. It seems hardly possible to distinguish them. After all, even the most basic point about a particular market, which is the system of relative prices, is inseparable from the idea of incentives. You try and buy cheap and sell dear. And it's not possible to distinguish the incentives from the arrangement. So what you're doing by a massive redistributive correction after the fact is in effect to cancel out what the market achieved. There were certain market transactions that achieved the so-called most efficient allocation of resources. And then you say, well, that won't count. Now we're going to redistribute the cards. Well, that could only work if it were very limited. Because if you canceled out the whole operation, what's the point? Go directly to the secondary allocation. So it is something that I think goes to the heart of the economic order. And in fact, all the compensatory redistribution that takes place in the world, almost all of it, is very peripheral. That's really an explanation of why compensatory redistribution is peripheral. And it's not that there's an insufficient political will. It's that it couldn't be massive, because if it were massive, it would turn the established market order upside down. That's the argument. Yes?
You described the system of allocation of capital, which is simultaneously decentralized in the sense that every society actor can have access to funds in a non-discretionary and conditional way.
In my thought experiment, yes.
Exactly. And at the same time, there is a public interest to this institution.
Yes.
And I'm wondering if this is similar to state investment banks that, to my knowledge, exist, or at least there are some experimental forms of such investment institutions.
Well, I'm not sure, because what ordinarily happens in the practice of public development banks is that they are associated with some kind of dualism in the credit markets. So in other words, there's a preferential allocation to certain economic agents who get money on cheaper terms than the rest. And that comes together with a set of perverse consequences. So it's not like that, because it's not that some segment of economic agents are being chosen because somehow they represent the most promising parts of production. When that happens, then the orthodox economists answer, you're picking winners. And when you pick winners, the losers will end up picking governments. That's the objection. In my thought experiment, there's no such selection. It's an absolutely universal and impersonal system. Whoever can ensure society acting through the state the highest rate of return for a certain set of resources gets to use those resources. Of course, it has to be organized in detail, and there are a world of problems. I was simply trying to illustrate the point about how radical the legal indeterminacy of the market is. Yes?
So I don't know that I necessarily agree that the only difference between like modern democratic socialism and modern kind of American-style capitalism is just in the level of compensatory redistribution. So, for instance, a lot of social democratic countries do things like ban private schooling because of the tendency for rich people to remove themselves from the system that other people have to use, and thus widen the gulf between the elite and the backwards part of the hierarchical structure. And this seems to me to be very, on the scale of what we've been talking about, very small structural differences, but structural differences nonetheless that you could imagine, if you're saying that we need to have a proximal and a distal version of this, That is one of the proximal structural changes.
But I wasn't making this argument. It's not. I wasn't making a comparison between the United States and Europe. This is an argument about how to understand the proper place of the most characteristic concern of the contemporary institutionally conservative social democrats, which is compensatory redistribution by tax and transfer. It's their most characteristic concern in Europe. It's their most characteristic concern in the United States. It's not to say that they're the same or that they're not a host of differences. It's just an argument about that point. But that's an immensely central point, because if we don't understand that, we're not going to understand almost anything else about the situation of contemporary social democracy. So if we place this in a larger geopolitical context, say this is now the hegemonic project of the North Atlantic elites on both sides of the Atlantic. The Democrats in the United States or their Canadian counterparts, the Social Democrats in Europe, let's make liberalism, in the European sense of liberalism, the market decentralization, let's make it social. And let's make social democracy liberal. Let's flexibilize it. Let's establish this synthesis between American-style economic flexibility and European-style social protection. That is what I'm calling the updating of the social democratic compromise. And what I'm now addressing is the single most salient point, which is the reliance on compensatory and retrospective redistribution as the overriding instrument for the moderation of inequality. That's the point under discussion. And that point has pertinence independently of the context. It has pertinence in Europe, in the United States, anywhere in the world. We have to have clarity about it. That's the point. It doesn't preempt your discussion of many other significant differences between these societies. Now then, second thesis. The second thesis goes to how we should approach the proper role of compensatory redistribution by tax and transfer. The first thesis says structural change has primacy. It has primacy over retrospective redistribution. But that doesn't mean that retrospective redistribution is useless or has no proper role. How should we understand the proper role of tax and transfer? Now, I begin with an enigma, a factual enigma generated by comparative fiscal experience in the advanced countries today. Compare the tax systems and social situations of the rich North Atlantic democracies. There is the following paradox. On paper, in many respects, the most progressive, quote, tax system is that of the United States, which is by far the most unequal of these rich North Atlantic democracies. On paper, it's the most progressive because it gives a relatively larger role to the progressive taxation of personal income. By contrast, the European social democracies, including the most egalitarian ones, like the Scandinavian social democracies, based their tax systems primarily on the regressive and indirect taxation of consumption. Characteristically, the regressive and indirect taxation of consumption operates through the comprehensive flat rate value added tax in most of these countries, or through some functional equivalent to the VAT, some quilt, some combination of consumption taxes, as in France. Now, how can this be? How can it be that the less equal country has the more egalitarian tax system, and the more equal ones have an avowedly and overtly regressive tax system? There's a very simple answer. The very simple answer is that the Europeans, these social democracies, take at least 10% of GDP more in the aggregate tax take than the Americans. And they are then able to use that public revenue to invest in people and in infrastructure. It's not that they then, according to the first thesis, go very far in moderating inequality. It's that they're able to sustain a much higher level of public investment, especially in people. And one of the byproducts of this higher level of public investment is a relative moderation of inequality. Now, that's still an incomplete statement of the thesis, because then there's the second element of the thesis. The second element of the thesis is to say that this indirect and avowedly regressive taxation of consumption makes it possible to maximize the tax take while mitigating the economically disruptive effect of taxation. Understand, take the VAT, the comprehensive flat rate value added tax. Conceptually, it is the most neutral possible tax. If you imagine the economy as an input-output table, what the VAT does is to take, in principle, if it is truly uniform and not riddled with exceptions, a constant proportion from the value of the transformation of every input into every output. And therefore, it is in principle the tax that is most neutral with respect to the system of relative prices. It is neutral. And it is the one that least disturbs the established arrangements and incentives. So it allows then the state to limit the effect of that tension between efficiency and equity, to take more, disturbing less, at the cost of tolerating a tax system that is overtly regressive. Now you see what happens in the United States. In the United States, the progressives say they want a higher tax take, but only through progressive taxation. And in their political practice and rhetoric, they privilege the element of progressivity rather than the aggregate level of the tax take. And the conservatives like the VAT because it is regressive, but they want a lower tax take. There is no one who wants a higher tax take achieved through regressive taxation. But that, according to the lessons of this comparative fiscal analysis, is what would be necessary. to fund the state and allow it then to perpetuate, to reenact this greatest historical achievement of social democracy, a higher level of investment in people and their capabilities. So the thesis then, in summary, is this: that with respect to the whole budget, viewed on both the revenue-raising side and the spending side, what matters most in the short term to the egalitarian concerns of the progressives is not the progressive profile of the tax system, but rather the aggregate level of the tax take and how it is spent. And if the aggregate level of the tax take can be raised, albeit at the cost of reliance on regressive taxation, then that in the short term is the best path forward. Now you see the problem that this thesis presents for practical politics. It is dialectical, it is paradoxical, it is complicated, it is counterintuitive. It has been sustained in Europe because its practical beneficence has been demonstrated. So in general, the conservative parties have been unable significantly to reduce the tax take. For the most part, they haven't even tried. Because the high level of the tax take has been seen to sustain a high level of public services that the vast majority of society, including the part of society that votes for the right of center parties, wants. And so it continues. But in the United States, the progressives have been able to cut this Gordian knot, and they have continued to prefer political pieties to transformative effects. Even these limited transformative effects achieved by the European Social Democrats. That's the second thesis. Now, it's hard to imagine anything that's closer to the practical stuff of politics, of political economy. But it's really interesting that things that are so basic are nevertheless subject to such confusion. It matters whether this thesis is true or not. And if it is true, there are decisive consequences that follow from it. And a great deal of contemporary politics and policy is based on a misunderstanding of these facts. So there's the second thesis. Now, what you say? Yes.
Is there, I'm just thinking, like, in Europe has traditionally had a lower level of consumption, personal consumption, than in the US. So is that one of the reasons why a VAT or similar consumption tax has been more palatable to the electorate there? Because I'm thinking in the US it would be viewed more harshly because of the higher level of consumption, so it would have more of an impact on people.
No, first of all, I'm not sure I understand, and if I understand, I don't agree with this thesis that the level of consumption is much lower. The standards of living are very comparable in the United States and in the richer European societies. What there has been, much more than a difference in consumption, is a difference in leverage. in indebtedness, both private and public. So here is a basic paradox, a basic problem of the American experience in the closing decades of the 20th century. The United States, in the aftermath of the Second World War, organized a system of economic growth that had two main foundations. One foundation was mass consumption and the deepening of a market in mass consumption goods. That was admired throughout the world. And that may be part of what you're referring to when you say a higher level of consumption. But with standardized mass consumption, making available to the masses goods and services that in most of the world up to that point had been available only to the moneyed classes. The second basis of economic growth in the United States since the Second World War can be summarized in two words: cheap money. The United States and its two major political parties had no strategy of economic growth. They delegated the strategy of economic growth to their central bank, the Federal Reserve. And it was based on very cheap money, very low interest rates for the vast part of this historical period. Now, there was a violently regressive redistribution of wealth and income in the United States in these last decades of the 20th century. How did the Americans manage to reconcile the maintenance of mass consumption with this regressive redistribution of income and wealth? In principle, mass consumption requires the popularization, the democratization of purchasing power. Part of the answer lies in the substitution of a property-owning democracy, the idea of a property-owning democracy, by a kind of fake credit democracy, made possible in part by the overvaluation of the housing stock as collateral. And that was part of the background to the financial and economic crisis of 2007 to 2009. The runaway indebtedness within the United States was in turn facilitated by the international situation. So the basic engine of growth in the world economy was the relation between the trade and capital surplus countries, especially China, and the trade and capital deficit countries, especially the United States. So the United States ceased to produce enough goods and services that the rest of the world wanted, and it continued consuming anyway, thanks to the internal leverage, which was in turn made possible by the Chinese trade and capital surpluses and the American trade and capital deficits. Each of these two countries used the imbalances in the world economy to escape from the imperative of internal structural transformation. So the United States would have to organize an escalation of productivity, and that would require structural change. Instead, it pursued this path of mass consumption based on credit and debt, and facilitated by these international imbalances. China would have to deepen its internal market and organize a massive redistribution within the country among regions, sectors, and classes. But that's not just an accounting exercise. That's a conflictual event which threatened the maintenance of despotic political power, turmoil in the country. It was easier to export the problem through this relation to the American economy. So all of that is part of the reality in the background of this that made possible this situation that we're that we're beginning to explore. All this second thesis is focusing on is the paradoxical role of compensatory redistribution. It does have a role, subsidiary to structural change. It's not a substitute for structural change. But in that role, it doesn't work the way we think it works. That's the point of the second thesis. Yes?
Starting with a very interesting riddle and a comparison between inequality in
Yes.
the US and European studies. I want to suggest a different answer that I think doesn't contradict your rationale. And my basis is the seminal research of Thomas Piketty and his book, The Capital of the 21st Century, where he proves that the cornerstone in the reproduction of inequalities is wealth and not income. So based on this, shouldn't we shift our focus to the taxation of wealth instead of income, and furthermore to intensify the taxation of wealth so as to hamper their...
I'm coming to that. The taxation of wealth is very difficult, but I'm coming to it in the third thesis. Yes?
Can I just ask a clarifying question?
Yes.
Obviously, in Europe as well, there are progressive taxes on income that make up, more than half of the revenue of taxes, in my understanding. In the UK, for example, VAT, I think it's about 40% of the income comes from that. So is your point just that a higher proportion of the income comes from...
Much higher proportion, and in the most egalitarian social democracies, characteristically an even higher proportion than in the United Kingdom. So, United Kingdom is relatively less egalitarian. Interestingly, as you say, it gives a relatively greater role to progressive taxation, as if it were halfway toward the American model. So then the third thesis. The third thesis is that if structural change trumps compensatory redistribution, and in compensatory redistribution, the aggregate level of the tax take and how it is spent trumps the progressive profile of taxation. There is nevertheless a subsidiary role for progressive taxation. So progressive taxation is subsidiary to the raising of the aggregate tax take, and the raising of the aggregate tax take and public spending on its basis is subsidiary to structural change. Now, what in principle are the proper targets of progressive taxation? It seems that in principle, the two most appropriate targets of progressive taxation are, first, the hierarchy of standards of living. What an individual takes out of the pool of social resources and spends on himself. And second, the accumulation of economic power. The income tax, which is the characteristic instrument of progressive taxation, is a somewhat confused and hybrid instrument, which hits neither of these targets squarely. So we can imagine a clear distinction. It's much easier, it turns out, to hit the first target than it is to hit the second. How would you hit the first target? The hierarchy of standards of living. You would hit it by an individualized and steeply progressive tax on consumption. So suppose you've organized the tax system largely on the basis of reliance on the indirect taxation of consumption, as through the VAT. Then it's easy to superimpose on this impersonal, neutral, and regressive tax on consumption, an individualized tax on consumption. You're just extending the logic of the reform tax system. And the individualized tax on consumption works like this. You take the aggregate income of the individual, not just income from labor, but income from capital. You give no favors to income from capital. And you subtract from the aggregate income of the individual invested saving, which the individual is, as it were, returning to the pool of social resources, at least temporarily. There is the problem of the accumulation of economic power. We have to deal with that separately. This difference between the aggregate income and the invested saving is what the individual spends on himself, the taxpayer, and turns into a certain standard of living. Then you can do the following. You can say, beneath a certain level of individualized consumption, the individual pays nothing. Maybe instead of paying, he receives. That's like the negative income tax. Then beyond that level, in a second part of the hierarchy, the individual begins to pay on a steeply progressive scale. And at the very top of the hierarchy, the sky's the limit. Conceptually, in the income tax, 100% is the top rate. But in the individualized consumption tax, there is no top rate. It all depends on political will and political power. You could say, above a certain level of luxury living, of luxury consumption, for every dollar the taxpayer spends on himself, he pays 4 to the state. The top rate is 400%. Why not that? There is no technical difficulty in this tax. The tax authorities in the world have argued about this for a long time. This tax has a history. Its greatest theoretician was one of Keynes's disciples, Nicholas Kaldor, and it is therefore sometimes called the Kaldor tax. And orthodox opinion among the tax experts, the jurists even more than the economists, has very often supported this tax. They say, why don't they do it? It has no technical difficulties other than the technical difficulties of the income tax. It's a declaratory tax. It has an advantage, which is that the saved income that is not declared counts as if it were spent and is therefore taxed. So it even reinforces or facilitates the enforcement of the declaratory tax. It seems that the main reason why it's not adopted is that it's so effective. So they say that they want redistribution through compensatory taxation. Why don't they do it this way? If that's what they really want, why don't they put their money where their mouth is? And why don't they really redistribute? They would be limited in the absence of structural change by the problems adduced in the argument about the first thesis. But they could, at least they would have the right instrument with which to hit this target. Now, the second target, which is the accumulation of economic power, is much harder to reach. Because any significant redistribution of assets, which are the basis of the accumulation of economic power, does very directly threaten to derange the economic order. and its associated incentives. So characteristically, the most accessible initial step in the taxation of wealth is the taxation of inheritance and of anticipated inheritance through gifts inter vivos, intra-family gifts. Because that then can be legitimated on the basis of the principle of equal opportunity and has a relatively less subversive effect on the established economic order. You all know how difficult it nevertheless is. Not many years ago, the two richest men in the United States organized a national campaign in favor of the defense of the estate tax. They took out full-page advertisements in the major American newspapers, and they did everything they could to defend the taxation of inheritance. They failed. But the taxation of inheritance or of anticipated inheritance is the most, in principle, the most promising first step in the taxation of wealth. For the taxation of wealth of assets, there seems to be no adequate substitute with greater reach for structural change. Now, it is a dramatic situation with respect to both income and wealth. Just to give you one little fact among many. In the United States, more than half of the families would be unable to put together $400 to meet an emergency. That's the situation. After these many decades of hegemony of the redistributivist idea among the progressives. So the least you could say is that it hasn't worked. And we therefore need a different approach, a different way of thinking. So that's the third thesis. Now you see, if you take these theses together, you can see they don't banish compensatory redistribution by tax and transfer, but they bring it down to size. They put it in its place. It's not an alternative to structural change. It's subsidiary. And if you're really serious about it, this is how you can do it. But on the whole, it seems that its defenders aren't that serious about it. And they use the gesture toward progressive taxation as a genuflection, as a way of showing what their social affinities are, on whose side they are. This is a calamity in which confusion of ideas, mass, vacuity and emptiness of a structural project. So let me ask you both about the third thesis and about the three theses together. Yes?
I just have a question. I don't understand why your proposal retains a regressive VAT, a flat rate VAT, universally, and then layers on progressive consumption tax. It seems like you could just have a role of progressive taxation as a progressive VAT that taxes different classes of goods and services differently depending on how luxurious the service was. So
Well, that's different, right? Because I think my initial reaction to that is that it's like the worst of both worlds, because you then, right at the outset, in the way of organizing the tax on consumption, you are failing to secure the tax take, because you were associating the basis of taxation, the anchor of taxation, with this tilting of the system of relative prices. And that will have dramatic economic consequences. So the advantage of this scheme is, you say, let's first guarantee the essential. The essential is that the state have a stable tax take with which it can invest in people and in infrastructure and guarantee their capabilities. What you would want to avoid by this separation of the two stages is that the exercise of obtaining the basic tax take and guaranteeing the fundamental endowments of the individual workers and citizens be overwhelmed by some dynamic of economic confusion produced by this intervention in the system of relative prices. So I'm not sanctifying the market order, because that was the whole point about the first thesis. I'm saying that to the extent that there is a market order, it's not the market in the abstract, it's a particular market. It has particular distributive consequences. You either change it or you respect its logic and take the tax take on the basis of that logic. But what seems to be perverse and counterproductive is to say, we won't change it, but we'll fight against it through this kind of retrospective intervention. That's what can't work, or it can work only to a very limited extent. So what I'm saying is you first stabilize the tax take, the budget, on the revenue raising and the spending side. And then you do your redistributive experiment, the third thesis, the third part of this arrangement, without jeopardizing the essentials. That seems to be a much more promising avenue. That's the argument.
So the underlying, I guess, premise is there's some level of market efficiency that...
No, it's not. No, I wouldn't put it that way, that there's some level of market efficiency. Because that then taps into the rhetoric that there is a natural market and that it is associated with allocational efficiency. That's not what I'm saying. I'm saying that given a particular market order, it has a logic. It has certain arrangements. These arrangements are associated with a system of relative prices and with a system of incentives. You can change that logic, but to maintain that logic as it is, and at the same time to interfere with it massively, seems to be an exercise in confusion, which will result in what first economic trouble and then very quickly political trouble. And that's why it's to be avoided. Whereas your way of phrasing it, as there's some logic of efficiency, is then going back into the orthodox doctrine that the market is the market. And as it exists, it is the machine that determines allocational efficiency, and you have to respect that. You have to respect that, but not because it's the impersonal agent of economic efficiency. It's because it is what it is. It's because it's established. It's what's in power. And if you want to replace that system, replace it, part by part. But don't pretend that it doesn't exist. Now, you can't all agree with this because you can't accept these three propositions and continue to be or to think like the progressives who exist and who think the way they do. So it's either true or false. Yes. No. Yes.
I'll ask a quick question. So the idea that progressives aren't serious about a progressive taxation system, because if they were, they'd do something like a consumption tax, I think may not be giving adequate weight to the political difficulties of today. By your own thesis, big structural change is difficult and fragmentary and doesn't happen
Yes.
at once. If we think of the consumption tax as a big change to the tax structure of our current country, then it is potentially too harsh on progressives to say they should do.
Yes, of course. But it's not such a big change because technically, you can think of this individualized consumption tax as an expanded income tax with an exemption for invested savings. So technically, what you're doing is you're simply extending what counts as income and suppressing any favor to capital, income from capital. And then on the other side, on the bottom, you're exempting invested saving. The result is you're making possible, although not necessary, a marginal tax rate that exceeds 100%. So it's simply establishing that possibility seems to be logical. And it has an additional advantage in a country that has a very low saving rate, which is in effect an incentive to saving and to investment.
I understand that technically it's not such a big change, but I think part of the power of your general thesis about fragmentary change is that while some things that may technically not be a big change, like changes require society to come along and understand the change slowly. And while technically a consumption tax may not be a big change, it will likely be seen as a big change.
Of course.
Politically.
You're absolutely right. You're absolutely right. But I wasn't imagining these three theses as the outline of a program that anyone in any real society would immediately translate into legislation. It's a way of thinking. And the point is that what's the truth about these matters? Because once you understand the way of thinking, then you can begin to discuss separately the tactical issue of how you get from there to there from here. But if you don't know what the reality is or the possibilities are, then you're lost because Montesquieu says no wind helps if you don't know to what port you're sailing. And so, and this is something which is very common among the progressives, the confusion of programmatic direction with tactical constraint. So it's like we can't be in the position of thinking only the ideas that are immediately acceptable or that can be immediately made palpable and intelligible. So these ideas are full of paradox and are difficult to explain, but they're not impossible to explain. And it is vital to understand the reality, the situation, to have an argument about it. And if you have a powerful view, a view that touches reality, then it will always be susceptible to translation. First of all, to translation into some discourse that everyone can understand. And second, susceptible to translation into some set of intermediate steps. What the intermediate steps are, of course, always depends on a very particular circumstance in time and in place, and you can't generalize about that. But I don't think that the central problem here is a problem of tactics. I think the problem is a problem of insight, of not understanding what the situation is. So I don't know, it seems to me that these three theses describe a position which contradicts the dominant position of the progressives. So we have to resolve the contradiction. Someone is wrong. They're wrong or I'm wrong, and I'm taking all of you here as a proxy, a representative for the established progressive opinion. So I expect you to fight back. Yes.
I just wanted to flesh out something.
Yes.
To your argument. So maybe progressives would say, well, you know, yeah, it's shitty right now, but we haven't even gotten to do the things we originally wanted to do. So
Yes.
if we just did that, maybe it would be good enough that we wouldn't have to do something radical. And then maybe a response to that as well, that it's precisely because there's such an impoverishment of ideas that they haven't gained any traction. And so I just wanted to ask, is part of this thesis that if this
But wait a minute, I didn't quite understand that formulation. You say because of the impoverished ideas. Are they saying it's because the other people have impoverished ideas? Or are they saying it's because we have impoverished ideas?
Well, it seems like there's some sort of feedback loop of being discredited. Like, they can't even get the policies they want to be law. And so their whole agenda is seen to be ineffective.
Yes.
And that further undermines the ability to get those policies. And a progressive might say, well, if you just gave us power for 10 years, we would, the current system we have would be embraced and it would make things better.
Yeah, but you're complicating things, because if you take the United States, and there are of course variants of this in all the advanced societies, there's a discourse in the newspapers every day, which the conservatives are telling the progressives, if you do this, it's going to have a huge economic cost. That's the conventional discourse. And they say, well, we want to do it anyway because it's fair and maybe the economic cost won't be that great and so forth. So that's where the conversation starts. So we can see that conversation as an entry point.
Well, I
For,
don't
right?
think the conversation is happening on such honest terms as you're saying. I mean, the progressives, I don't think they would say the cost isn't as great as you're saying. They would say the present system has an immense cost in
Of course.
no one being educated, blah, blah, blah. So, I mean, they would say that if you just did what we want, which is the classical progressive thing that you're talking about, then there would be a dramatic reduction of inequality, a liberation of people's productive.
And what would happen to economic growth?
Well, I'm just wondering, is what part of what you're saying that that if the conversation became more expansive, then there would be a shift in public
No, that's not my interpretation. Maybe I disagree with you about what actually happens in the political practice. So it's true that they make all of these gestures, and they say they want this, they want that, this kind of redistribution. That's what they say when they're in opposition. It's not what they do when they're in power, because they are impressed by the limitations. So what they really think is something that a leading leftist statesman in the world explained to me. He explained to me, because he thought I required enlightenment, that he said, power is like a violin. You pick it up with the left hand and you play it with the right hand. So that seems to be what they really think. They think that against the background of this confusion. Yes.
Given the complications that at least folks
Yes.
are thinking about actually implementing some version of this tax system, could you give a sense of where this fits in terms of prioritization? If you had to choose between allocating your time towards advancing this versus other things, especially given your first thesis about the importance of adjusting the primary allocation, is there a sense of scale about how much this tax change matters relative to other things that would change the primary distribution?
I think the object of this third thesis, and especially the individualized tax of consumption, is a kind of luxury. It's a political luxury. So it comes third in the sequence, because you have to have proceeded already quite far to make plausible that kind of a transformation. So it's simply to qualify the thrust of the first two theses and to say, I'm not intending to deny that there is a possible role for progressive taxation. It's subsidiary to something that is already subsidiary. Subsidiary to the tax take, which is subsidiary to structural change. But if you've already begun to advance and you're in the position where you have the economic and political basis for redistribution and you're clear-sighted about it, this is how you might do it. So, for example, there's a discussion now around the world about the minimum guaranteed income. This fits into this because in the individualized consumption hierarchy, the bottom part is where you don't pay and you even receive. But the danger is when this third element becomes then a substitute for the other two because it represents this redistributivism. That's what's likely to be articulated in opposition but not implemented in power. Yes?
So, if I understood correctly, one commonality between the three theses that you described is that as a methodological point of reference, they have the nation state. So, I'm asking, since we are in a period where economies are so globalized and national borders are so meaningless, and even though legal frameworks have remained, they have as a basis the nation state. Why shouldn't we look for ideas such as the Tobin tax, financial transaction tax, in which transactions across the planet are taxed instantly with a very small percentage that has the potential to accumulate a huge amount of resources to compensate ex post inequalities?
Well, it seems that you're asking two different questions. So one question is about the relation of national transformation to transformation of the global order. And is that right? And the other question is a specific question about the Tobin tax. It's this idea of
I'm seeing a paradox here. Even though we have very globalized economies,
Yes.
at least in the North Atlantic regions, at the same time, legal frameworks when it comes to taxations are very nation sensitive.
Yes.
So ideas such as the Tobin tax that starts in the 70s about creating, agreeing on a small tax that can be applied to every financial transaction that is happening instantly, a very small percentage of 0.01%. This kind of tax has the capacity to kill two birds with one stone. On the one hand, reduce volatility of markets because you reduce the fast trading and speculative trading, attacks to currency, for example. And on the other hand, you accumulate a huge amount of resources to do social policies or...
I don't agree. I don't agree. There are two fundamental objections to it. The first objection is that capital flows are not inherently good or bad. It depends which. And one of the problems with this Tobin tax is that it doesn't distinguish. The vast majority of capital stays at home. Only a small percentage of capital flows to the world. And some of those flows are good and some are bad. And there's no generic argument against flows of capital, as if financial flows per se were diabolical. But the second objection to it is that it supposes that there's a kind of global project and a global elite tending to this project, and they'll finance themselves through this tax. There is no such project, and there shouldn't be. There are people who would like it to exist now, but that's going to lead us into the discussion of the relation between these national alternatives that we're discussing and the global alternatives. So let me just use your provocation to anticipate a position with respect to that. So the debate about markets that underlies these three theses is premised on the notion that the axis of controversy should not be more market, less market, as it has been in 200 years of ideological controversy. It should be which kind of market. And similarly with respect to globalization, the issue is not more or less globalization. The issue is which globalization. Now, there is an asymmetry between transformation in the national order and transformation in the global order. Because in the world as it's now organized, the nation state remains the primary context of transformation. The global order is derivative. Globalization has taken a very particular direction. And let me illustrate this direction by the World Trade Regime, as it has been established under the WTO treaties and then under the multilateral trade agreements, like the Trans-Pacific and the Transatlantic. This regime is organized according to what you could describe as a principle of institutional maximalism. It says, in effect, that in order to engage in the world trading system, the member states have to subscribe not just to the market economy in the abstract, but to a very particular kind of market economy. So, for example, they have to accept that all strategic coordination between the state and private firms will be prohibited under the label subsidies. The same forms of strategic partnership that the countries that are now rich used to become rich. They have to accept, to take another example, that the whole odious regime of intellectual property that was developed at the end of the 19th century and that leaves many of the technological innovations most important to humanity in the control of a handful of multinational businesses be incorporated into the world trade rules. What is the interest of humanity? The interest of humanity is to organize the world trading system on a principle of institutional minimalism. The greatest economic openness with the least restraint on domestic institutional experiments, including experiments in the way of organizing a market economy. And that's not impossible. We know it's possible because, for example, it characterized the regime that immediately preceded the WTO, which was the regime of the GATT. And then for centuries in the West, it characterized the law merchant, which was premised on radical difference in the laws and institutions of the underlying jurisdictions, and showing how you could go very far in interaction and openness with a minimum of restraint. So again, this established form of globalization that proceeds according to this institutional maximalism is also characterized by a radical distinction between the treatment of the mobility of capital and of goods and the mobility of people. So the idea is things and money should gain the greatest freedom to roam the world as quickly as possible, but people should be imprisoned in the nation state or in blocks of homogeneous nation states like the European Union. There's no basis in democratic theory or in economic theory for this stark distinction among the treatment of the factors of production. But that's how it is. Now, so what might we want is an alternative, that things, money, and people gain freedom together in small cumulative steps so that the friends of strong national projects would not be forced to become the enemies of an open world order. Now, how is such a change going to come about? It's not going to come about as the gift of an enlightened cosmopolitan elite. It's not going to come about because the economics professors in the United States or the people who get together in Davos think it's a good idea. It's only going to come about if there's pressure from below, if there's strong national projects that hit against the limits of this form of globalization. And that's really the main object of our discussion here in the course. These strong national projects, we're beginning to discuss their preconditions and their elements. There would have to be these strong national projects. And what is a strong national project? It's a project that mobilizes the physical, financial, economic, and human resources of a country to build a strategy of development manifest in institutional innovations, in a distinct set of political and economic institutions. And then a subset of those strong national projects of greatest interest to us, who are looking for a project for the progressives, are those that establish the basis of inclusive economic growth and give the greatest part of the population, in particular, access to the most advanced part of production, associating the enhancement of productive agency with the democratization of opportunities and capabilities. That's what has to happen. And it seems that in the first instance, it has to happen down below at the level of the nation states before there can be any forcing of a change in the direction of globalization. That's my premise. And it requires a different way of thinking about the alternatives. You know that in the world today, the common assumption of the progressives is that there is a universal orthodoxy, sometimes called neoliberalism, or it's also this liberalized social democracy married with neoliberalism. And then there are local heresies. The local heresies, the Chinese way, the Brazilian model, whatever, the local heresies are composed of a combination of elements of the universal orthodoxy with local adaptations. But what I think is that a universal orthodoxy can be successfully combated only by a universalizing heresy, not by local heresies. And that's what everyone always thought, up to very recently. Karl Marx, John Stuart Mill, liberalism, socialism, these doctrines of the 19th century were universalizing heresies. They're not a message for one country. And then there's a contest in the world. So that's another way to understand what the object of argument in the course is. It's the content of this universalizing heresy. Yes.
So, through the distribution of wealth or taxation, always create inclusive growth as well as social security for the marginalized and poor people. At the same time, it also contracts the profit of the capitalists. So it creates tension between not two groups.
Now, what's the subject of these sentences?
So my question is, how can they sustain such kind of system in the future? I mean, the redistribution of taxation. As you said, they are like 100% progressive taxation.
But
How can they sustain this structural arrangement?
I'm sorry, I didn't understand. Can someone help here in the, yes.
My question is, because of the progressive taxation,
Yes.
it contracts the wealth of the capitalists.
It can't go very far. Yes, I argued, and in the second thesis, that progressive taxation can't go very far. It can't establish a massive redistribution without deranging the economy. Yes. And so if we're the fundamental basis of redistribution cannot be this retrospective correction. It has to be structural change. And this is really a very vital point because the whole nature of the social democratic compromise from the beginning was a retreat from an agenda of structural change. So it said, we're not going to attempt to invent another economic system, another political system, and in return for this abdication, the state will be allowed to ameliorate and to regulate, to mitigate inequality through retrospective redistribution, and to manage the economy countercyclically. Now it turns out that there's no significant problem of the contemporary societies that can be faced without structural change. It's complicated for the reason that I mentioned in the very first class, that when we think of structural change, we think of some big systemic substitution. So it's like putting socialism in the place of capitalism. And that's unthinkable, or it's too dangerous. But that's not the right way to think about structural change. So what I'm trying to begin to demonstrate by these arguments is that structural change, in principle, always has a fragmentary character. And so we have this binary view in which we associate deep change, structural change, with total change, systemic change. And we associate gradualism or fragmentary change with superficial reformism. But that's absurd. That's not how structural change happens in history. We have to recombine these elements so that we understand how change that is fragmentary can nevertheless be structural in its impact and even revolutionary in its outcome. That's the crucial point of method. And what I was intending to do in the final part of the class, in much of the class, was then to go through that list of the unsolved problems of the contemporary societies. What lies beyond the horizon of social democracy? You see that I haven't even gotten to the first. So we just discussed what I thought would be the prolegomenon, the preliminary, of the theses about inequality and the role of compensatory redistribution. But this is fundamental because those ideas about compensatory redistribution are more than half of the conventional progressive agenda. And we have to position ourselves with respect to them. And that leads to a different way of thinking. What I would like to take as central and give special emphasis to here in this course is this problem of the knowledge economy. So it is the most important instance of the problem of the hierarchical segmentation of the economy. And let me restate the problem so you can think about it in anticipation of next week's class. There is a revolutionary practice of production. Mass production has declined. It's no longer the vanguard. What we call conventional industry, Fordist mass production. There's a new vanguard, which we call the new economy, the experimental economy, the knowledge economy. It's not just a bunch of gadgets. We shouldn't think of it just by reference to its characteristic technologies. After all, the better way to think about technology is that technology is just the connection, the materialization of the connection between our experiments with the transformation of nature and our experiments with the transformation of the ways in which we cooperate. The knowledge economy consists in a new set of practices that use these technologies. And it is not confined just to high-tech industry. It exists in every part of the economy. But in every part of the economy, it's just a fringe that excludes the vast majority of businesses and of workers. That's the situation in the world. And conventional industry continues to exist either as a residue, a vestige, a leftover of the earlier vanguard, increasingly outcompeted by the new vanguard on its own terrain, or as a sidekick, producing for the vanguard that part of the vanguard production process that can be transformed into commodities, into routines. But this new advanced form of production, rather than being disseminated to the whole economy, is present in every part of the production system, only as a fringe. So then there is a deepening of the chasm between the advanced and the backward parts of production. So now come the conventional social democrats and the right-wing populists, and they say, we're going to try and give mass production, declining mass production, a few more years. We're going to protect it against plant closings or against migratory flows. We're going to subsidize it. But it's not going to come back. It has no future. So this is a lost cause. On the other hand, what is the alternative? The alternative would be an inclusive form of the knowledge economy. It's dissemination through a large part of the production system, so that the majority of the population wouldn't be confined to what is increasingly some kind of make work. But that doesn't exist. It doesn't exist even in the richest countries with the most educated populations. So a vital part of the progressive project today would have to be a solution to this dilemma. Dilemma is very simply stated. The conventional route to rapid economic growth, which is conventional industrialization, has stopped working. But the alternative, which would be an inclusive form of the knowledge economy, seems to be inaccessible. That's the dilemma. That dilemma has to be solved. And it seems that the only way in which it could be solved, in principle, would be by breaking the dilemma on the second side. That is to say, by transforming what seems now to be inaccessible into something accessible. And the way to do that would be to break it up into pieces or into steps. Now, that's very far from being the whole of a progressive project, but is a very important part of the project. Because it would root the progressive project in economic realities. And allow the progressives to have an agenda for the supply side of the economy and not just for the demand side. And it is then connected to the issue that I raised in the very first class, which is you lose in politics if all you're doing is proposing to humanize the project of your adversaries. The force that commands the agenda is the force that most credibly embodies the cause of creation, of construction, of innovation, of energy, and not just the humanization. Transformative effects over pietistic intentions. So then the next class will be devoted to what social democracy can't do, the list. And then from there we'll go on to the more detailed examination of this dilemma of the knowledge economy. See you next week.